What happened to Moses' mysterious wife? It's a question that has puzzled biblical scholars, theologians, and curious believers for thousands of years. We know Moses as the great lawgiver, the man who parted the Red Sea, who spoke with God face to face on Mount Sinai. But when it comes to his personal life, particularly his marriage, the Bible becomes strangely silent, leaving us with more questions than answers. Here's what we do know. Moses had at least one wife, possibly two. Her name was Zipporah, a Midianite woman, daughter of Jethro the priest. But then, mysteriously, the Bible mentions something that has sparked centuries of debate. In Numbers chapter 12, we read about Moses marrying a Cushite woman. Was this the same person as Zipporah, or was this someone entirely different? And if it was someone different, what happened to his first wife? But here's where it gets even more intriguing. After Moses sends his wife away before the Exodus, she virtually disappears from the biblical narrative. No death is recorded, no final goodbye, no explanation of what became of her. It's as if she simply vanished from history, leaving behind one of the Bible's most enduring mysteries. If you're ready to dive deep into this ancient puzzle, comment yes below. And make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we are about to uncover secrets that have been hidden in plain sight for millennia. This isn't just about one woman's story. It's about understanding the complex dynamics of faith, culture, and sacrifice that shaped the life of one of history's most important figures. Now let's journey back to the burning sands of ancient Midian, where a chance encounter at a well would change the course of biblical history forever. Picture this scene. A young man recently fled from Egypt sits alone by a well in the wilderness of Midian. His hands are probably still stained with the memory of violence, his heart heavy with the weight of exile. This is Moses, no longer a prince of Egypt, now a fugitive with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The blazing sun beats down mercilessly as he watches the horizon, uncertain of his future. Then, like something out of an ancient love story, 7 sisters approach the well. They're daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian, coming to water their father's flocks just as they do every day. But today would be different. Today, their lives would intersect with destiny itself. As the young women begin drawing water for their animals, trouble arrives. Local shepherds, rough and aggressive, drive the sisters away from the well. It's a scene that speaks to the harsh realities of ancient life, where wrong might often be made to seem right, and women were frequently at the mercy of stronger, more aggressive men. But then Moses does something remarkable. This Egyptian refugee, this man with blood on his hands and a price on his head, stands up for these foreign women. He doesn't just speak up. He acts. He drives away the shepherds and personally helps water the flocks. It's an act of courage and kindness that reveals the heart of the man who would one day lead an entire nation to freedom. When the sisters return home earlier than usual, their father Jethro is curious. How did you finish your work so quickly today? And that's when they tell him about the Egyptian who rescued them, who showed them kindness when others showed them cruelty. Jethro's response is immediate and telling. Where is this man? Why did you leave him at the well? Go and invite him to share a meal with us. It's a moment that speaks to the sacred duty of hospitality in ancient cultures, but it's also something more. Perhaps Jethro recognizes something special in this stranger, some quality that goes beyond mere politeness. And so Moses enters the household of Jethro, and it's here that he meets the woman who would become his wife, Zipporah. Her name means bird in Hebrew, and like a bird, she would prove to be both beautiful and elusive, present one moment and gone the next. The Bible doesn't give us the romantic details. We don't know how long their courtship lasted, what they talked about during those desert evenings, or what drew them to each other. What we do know is that Moses, the Hebrew raised as an Egyptian, married Zipporah, the Midianite daughter of a priest. It was a union that crossed cultural, religious, and ethnic boundaries in ways that would prove both blessed and complicated. But this wasn't just any marriage. This was the marriage of the man who would become the greatest prophet in Jewish history, the lawgiver of Israel, the one chosen to lead God's people out of bondage. And his wife? She was a foreigner, a Gentile, someone outside the covenant community of Israel. Think about that for a moment. The man chosen to receive the 10 Commandments, to establish the religious laws that would govern Israel for millennia, was married to a woman from outside the faith. What does that tell us about God's plans? What does it reveal about the inclusive nature of his purposes, even in the earliest days of Israel's history? During their years in Midian, Moses and Zipporah had 2 sons. Gershom, whose name means, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land," reflecting Moses' sense of exile and displacement. And Eliezer, meaning "my God is my help," perhaps indicating a growing sense of divine purpose and calling in Moses' life. For 40 years, Moses lived as a shepherd in the wilderness, tending Jethro's flocks, raising his family, seemingly settling into a quiet life, far from the palaces of Egypt and the groaning of Hebrew slaves. It was a peaceful existence, but it wasn't meant to last. Then came the burning bush, the voice of the Almighty calling Moses back to Egypt, back to his people, back to a destiny he thought he had left behind forever. "I have heard the cry of my people," God declared. "I have seen their suffering, and I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." But here's where Zipporah's story takes a dramatic and mysterious turn. As Moses prepares to return to Egypt with his family, something happens that has puzzled biblical scholars for centuries. It's one of the strangest passages in all of Scripture, and it reveals something profound about the cultural and religious tensions that existed within Moses' own household. The family is traveling toward Egypt when they stop at an inn for the night. Suddenly, without warning, God appears and seeks to kill Moses. The text is stark, almost brutal in its simplicity. The Almighty, who had just commissioned Moses for the greatest rescue mission in history, now threatens to end his life before the mission even begins. But Zipporah understands immediately what's happening. Her husband has failed to circumcise their son, a violation of the covenant God had made with Abraham centuries earlier. It was a sign of belonging to God's people, a mark of the covenant that set the Israelites apart from all other nations. And Moses, for whatever reason, had delayed this crucial act. Maybe it was cultural sensitivity. The Midianites practiced circumcision, but as a rite of passage into manhood, not as an infant ceremony. Maybe Moses was torn between his Hebrew heritage and his Midianite family life. Or perhaps, after 40 years in the wilderness, he had simply forgotten the urgency of this ancient command. But Zipporah doesn't hesitate. She takes a sharp stone, circumcises her son herself, and touches Moses' feet with the foreskin, declaring, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." It's a moment of quick thinking and decisive action that literally saves her husband's life. But it's also a moment that reveals the deep cultural tensions that existed within their marriage. The phrase "bridegroom of blood" has echoed through history, interpreted in countless ways by scholars and theologians. Some see it as an expression of anger, Zipporah lashing out at the violent demands of her husband's God. Others interpret it as a moment of profound spiritual understanding, where a Midianite woman demonstrates her acceptance of Hebrew covenant practices. But here's what makes the story even more mysterious. After this dramatic incident, after Zipporah literally saves Moses' life through her quick action and cultural bridge building, she disappears from the narrative. Not immediately, but soon enough to leave us wondering what really happened to the woman who stood between Moses and death itself. As Moses approaches Egypt, we're told that Aaron, his brother, meets him and delivers a harsh message. "The situation in Egypt is terrible," Aaron says. "The Hebrew slaves are suffering more than ever. And you want to bring more people into this chaos." The implication is clear. Moses should send his family away, back to the safety of Midian, away from the dangers that await in Egypt. And that's exactly what happens. Moses sends Zipporah and their 2 sons back to her father's house. But was this really Aaron's idea, or was there something deeper going on? Was Moses himself having second thoughts about the wisdom of bringing his foreign wife into the heart of Hebrew liberation? Think about the weight of that decision. Here was Moses, about to embark on the most important mission in human history, and he's making a choice that would separate him from his wife and children. Was it protection? Was it politics? Or was it something far more personal and painful? The text gives us hints, but they're subtle and troubling. When Moses finally reunites with Aaron and the Hebrew elders, there's no mention of grief over his separated family, no longing expressed for his wife. It's as if, in that moment, Moses chose his divine calling over his earthly relationships. And perhaps that choice reveals something profound about the cost of leadership, the price of being chosen by God for an impossible task. But Zipporah's story doesn't end there. After the Exodus, after the parting of the Red Sea, after the dramatic escape from Egypt, she reappears in the narrative. Jethro, her father, brings her and the two sons to Moses in the wilderness. You'd expect this to be a joyful reunion, a celebration of family restored after the successful completion of the mission. Instead, the Bible gives us one of the most emotionally cold passages you'll ever read. Moses goes out to meet Jethro, bows down, kisses him, and brings him into his tent. But Zipporah? Not a word. No greeting recorded. No embrace described. No acknowledgement of the woman who had saved his life, who had borne his children, who had waited faithfully while he changed the course of history. It's a silence that screams louder than any argument. And it raises a question that cuts to the heart of Moses' character. Had success changed him? Had his encounter with the divine made him less human? Or was there something about his calling that demanded a separation from earthly attachments that most of us could never understand? Some scholars suggest that Moses deliberately distanced himself from Zipporah because his role as prophet required constant readiness to speak with God. Unlike other prophets who could maintain normal family lives, Moses was on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. His direct line to the Almighty meant that intimate human relationships became, in a sense, impossible. But that raises an even more troubling question. If Moses had to choose between his wife and his calling, what does that say about the nature of divine service? What does it reveal about the sacrifices required of those chosen to stand between heaven and earth? This pattern continues throughout the rest of Moses' story. When God tells the Israelites to consecrate themselves and avoid sexual relations before receiving the law at Mount Sinai, Moses extends this command beyond what God actually said. God told the people to be ready in 3 days and not to approach women during that time. But Moses apparently decided that his constant communication with God required permanent separation from his wife. Think about the sacrifice this represents for Zipporah. She married a shepherd and found herself wed to a prophet. She signed up for a quiet life in Midian and instead became part of the most significant event in Israel's history. Yet her role was to be increasingly marginalized, her voice silenced, her presence minimized. The woman who had once been decisive enough to save Moses' life was now expected to fade into the background of his divine calling. This brings us to one of the most controversial and mysterious passages in all of Scripture. In Numbers chapter 12, we encounter a story that has puzzled interpreters for thousands of years. Aaron and Miriam, Moses' own brother and sister, begin criticizing him because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. Wait a minute, Cushite woman? Who is this? Zipporah was a Midianite, not a Cushite. Cush typically refers to the region we now know as Sudan or Ethiopia, the land south of Egypt populated by dark-skinned African peoples. So who is this Cushite woman, and when did Moses marry her? This is where the story becomes even more intriguing. Some scholars argue that Cushite is just another way of referring to Zipporah, perhaps because the Midianites lived in desert regions and had darker skin than the Israelites. Others suggest that the term was used metaphorically, calling Zipporah Cushite the same way someone might use a nickname. But there's another possibility, one that's supported by ancient Jewish historians and extra-biblical sources. What if Moses had 2 wives? What if there was indeed a Cushite woman, an African princess, who was Moses' first wife before he ever met Zipporah? This isn't just modern speculation. The first-century historian Josephus tells a remarkable story about Moses' early life in Egypt. According to Josephus, when Moses was a young man in Pharaoh's court, he was given command of an Egyptian army sent to fight against the Ethiopians. The Ethiopian capital was under siege, and Moses was leading the assault. But then something unexpected happened. The Ethiopian princess, whose name was Tharbais, saw Moses fighting with such courage and skill that she fell in love with him. She sent messengers to Moses with an offer. She would surrender the city if he would agree to marry her. Moses accepted the proposal, took the city without further bloodshed, and married the Ethiopian princess. According to this account, Moses spent years in Ethiopia as the husband of Princess Tharbais. Some traditions suggest he even ruled as king of Ethiopia for a time. This would explain the reference in Acts chapter 7, where Stephen mentions that Moses was mighty in words and deeds before he fled Egypt. It would also provide context for understanding why Moses was so confident in his abilities as a military leader and administrator. But if this story is true, what happened to Tharbais? Why isn't she mentioned in the book of Exodus? The most likely explanation is that she died before Moses fled to Midian, or that their marriage was annulled when Moses left Egypt. Either way, by the time Moses meets Zipporah at the well, he's a widower starting a new life in exile. This background makes the Numbers 12 passage much clearer. When Aaron and Miriam criticize Moses for marrying the Cushite woman, they might not be talking about a recent marriage at all. They could be bringing up his past relationship with Tharbais, perhaps using it as ammunition in a larger power struggle within the leadership of Israel. But here's what's really significant about this story. If Moses did indeed marry an African princess, it means that one of the most important figures in biblical history was married to a black woman. In an era when racial tensions still divide communities and churches, this detail isn't just historically interesting. It's theologically significant. God's response to Aaron and Miriam's criticism is swift and severe. He calls all three siblings to the tabernacle and speaks to them directly. He reminds them that Moses is unique among the prophets, that God speaks to him face to face rather than through dreams and visions. Then he asks a pointed question: "Why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Immediately, God's anger burns against Aaron and Miriam, and when the cloud of his presence lifts from the tabernacle, Miriam is struck with leprosy. Her skin becomes white as snow, a detail that some interpreters see as ironic justice. She criticized Moses for marrying a dark-skinned woman, so God makes her skin unnaturally white as a sign of disease and separation. Aaron has to plead with Moses to intercede for their sister, and Moses cries out to God for her healing. But even then, God requires Miriam to remain outside the camp for 7 days, bearing the shame of her opposition to Moses' marriage choices. What's the message here? God himself defends Moses' marriage to the Cushite woman. The creator of all nations and peoples makes it clear that he has no problem with interracial marriage. In fact, he punishes those who do have a problem with it. This story challenges a lot of assumptions that people have made throughout history about God's attitude toward race and marriage. It suggests that the divisions humans create based on skin color or ethnicity are not divisions that God recognizes or endorses. But it also raises new questions about Zipporah's role in all of this. If Moses had been married to an Ethiopian princess, and if God approved of that marriage, where does that leave his Midianite wife? Was she always meant to be secondary to his calling? Was her marginalization part of God's plan, or was it a human failure on Moses' part? These questions become even more complex when we consider what happened to Zipporah after the wilderness wandering was complete. The Bible never records her death. She simply vanishes from the narrative, leaving us to wonder whether she lived to see the promised land or died forgotten in the wilderness. What makes Zipporah's disappearance even more haunting is that she's not the only woman in Moses' Story who gets erased from the narrative. Think about this pattern for a moment. Moses' own mother, Jochebed, risks everything to save her baby son by placing him in a basket on the Nile River. She devises the plan that ultimately leads to Moses being raised in Pharaoh's household. Yet after that crucial moment, she virtually disappears from Scripture. We get no record of Moses reuniting with her during the Exodus, no mention of her witnessing her son's triumph over Egypt. Then there's Miriam, Moses' sister, who watched over baby Moses from the riverbank and later became a prophetess and leader in her own right. She leads the women of Israel in worship after crossing the Red Sea. She's called a prophetess, and yet her story gets overshadowed by her brother's narratives. Even when she's punished for criticizing Moses, the focus remains on Moses' response rather than her perspective or motivations. This pattern of women being crucial to the story, but then marginalized or forgotten entirely, isn't unique to Moses' family. It's woven throughout Scripture, and it raises profound questions about whose voices get preserved and whose contributions get remembered. Were these omissions intentional? Were they cultural blind spots? Or is there something deeper happening in the way these stories were recorded and passed down through generations? In Zipporah's case, the silence becomes even more mysterious when we consider the archaeological and historical evidence from the ancient Near East. Egyptian records from Moses' time period mention relationships between Egyptian officials and foreign princesses. Marriage alliances were common diplomatic tools, used to secure peace treaties and establish trade relationships. If Moses really did marry an Ethiopian princess during his years in Egypt, there should be some trace of it in the historical record. Yet despite extensive excavations and decades of scholarship, no definitive evidence has emerged to confirm the Josephus account of Moses and Tharbais. This absence of evidence doesn't disprove the story, but it does make us wonder. Was this marriage so politically sensitive that it was deliberately erased from Egyptian records? Or is the Josephus account a later embellishment, created to fill in gaps in Moses' biography? Some scholars have suggested that the story of Moses' Ethiopian wife serves a different purpose entirely. They argue that it's not meant to be historical biography, but rather theological commentary. In this interpretation, Moses' marriage to a Cushite woman represents God's inclusive vision for his people. It foreshadows the day when the gospel would go to all nations, when the barriers between Jews and Gentiles would be broken down. This theological reading gains support when we look at other places in Scripture where Cushites appear. The book of Isaiah prophesies about Cushites bringing gifts to the Lord. The Psalms speak of Cush stretching out her hands to God. In Acts, we meet the Ethiopian eunuch who becomes one of the first Gentile converts to Christianity. Throughout Scripture, Cushites represent the inclusion of African peoples in God's redemptive plan. If Moses really did marry a Cushite woman, it would make him a living symbol of that inclusion. The man who received the law, who established the covenant relationship between God and Israel, would himself be connected through marriage to the nations beyond Israel's borders. His interracial marriage would be a preview of the global scope of God's love. But this interpretation, while theologically rich, doesn't resolve the mystery of what happened to these women in Moses' life. Whether we're talking about Zipporah, the Midianite, or Tharbais, the Ethiopian, both seem to fade from the story just when we most want to know about their experiences. What was it like to be married to the man who spoke with God face to face? How did they cope with the isolation that Moses' calling seemed to require? Did they feel abandoned? Or did they understand that they were part of something larger than themselves? The few clues we get in Scripture suggest that Moses' relationship with his wives was complicated by his unique role as mediator between God and Israel. The Talmud, the collection of Jewish rabbinic teachings, contains discussions about Moses' marital life that are both fascinating and troubling. According to these traditions, Moses separated himself from Zipporah not out of personal preference, but out of spiritual necessity. The reasoning goes like this: other prophets received revelations from God at specific times and then returned to normal life. But Moses was in constant communication with the divine. God might speak to him at any moment, day or night. Since the law required ritual purity for anyone approaching God, and since sexual relations created a state of ritual impurity, Moses had to maintain permanent separation from his wife. This explanation makes Moses' behavior seem more understandable, but it also raises disturbing questions about the cost of spiritual calling. If closeness to God requires a distance from human relationships, what does that say about the nature of divine service? Is intimacy with the divine incompatible with human intimacy? And what about the women who bear the cost of these spiritual demands? Zipporah never gets to speak for herself about these issues. We don't know whether she agreed with Moses' decision to separate from her, whether she felt called to make this sacrifice for the good of Israel, or whether she experienced it as abandonment and rejection. The Bible preserves Moses' perspective on his calling, but remains silent about the human cost paid by those closest to him. This silence becomes even more poignant when we consider the timing of Zipporah's return to Moses in Exodus 18. She arrives just after one of the most significant events in Moses' ministry, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. The Israelites have just entered into a covenant relationship with God, complete with detailed instructions for worship, justice, and community life. It's a moment of triumph and fulfillment for Moses, yet Zipporah's reunion with her husband seems strangely muted. There's no emotional scene, no celebration of their time apart finally ending. Instead, the focus remains on Jethro's wise counsel about delegating leadership responsibilities. It's almost as if Zipporah is present but invisible, physically there but narratively absent. Some commentators have suggested that this reunion was actually the beginning of the end for Moses and Zipporah's marriage. Perhaps she returned expecting to resume their life together, only to discover that Moses had changed too much during their separation. Perhaps the man who came down from Mount Sinai, with his face shining from exposure to God's glory, was no longer the shepherd she had married in Midian. Or perhaps the problem was the opposite. Maybe Zipporah looked at the chaos and complexity of leading Israel through the wilderness and decided she wanted no part of it. Life with Moses had once meant peaceful days tending flocks in Midian. Now it meant constant crises, complaints from hundreds of thousands of people, and a husband who was always either meeting with God or dealing with some new emergency. The traditional Jewish view is that Zipporah accepted her husband's spiritual calling and willingly sacrificed their marital relationship for the good of Israel. In this interpretation, she becomes a model of selfless devotion, putting the needs of God's people above her own desires for companionship and intimacy. She's celebrated as a woman who understood that sometimes love means letting go. But there's another way to read this story, one that's less comfortable but perhaps more honest about the human cost of spiritual leadership. Maybe Zipporah's silence in the later narratives isn't noble sacrifice, but enforced marginalization. Maybe she wanted to be part of Moses' ministry, but was excluded because of cultural assumptions about women's roles. Maybe she had insights and abilities that could have benefited Israel's journey through the wilderness, but no one thought to ask for her input. This reading gains credibility when we consider how other women in the Exodus story are treated. Miriam is a prophetess and leader, but she's punished when she challenges Moses' authority. The daughters of Zelophehad have to fight for their inheritance rights. Even in a story about liberation from oppression, women often find themselves struggling for recognition and agency. What makes Zipporah's story particularly tragic is that we know she was capable of decisive action when it mattered most. The circumcision scene at the inn shows us a woman who could think quickly under pressure, who understood spiritual realities, and who wasn't afraid to take initiative when her husband's life was at stake. Yet after that moment of heroism, she's reduced to a footnote in the larger narrative. This pattern of women being crucial in moments of crisis, but then marginalized in ongoing leadership roles, is one that continues throughout biblical history. We see it with Deborah the judge, who leads Israel to military victory, but then steps back from prominence. We see it with Esther, who saves her people from genocide, but then disappears from the narrative after her moment of triumph. In Zipporah's case, the marginalization seems particularly cruel because it affects not just her public role, but her most intimate relationships. She's separated not only from Moses' ministry, but from Moses himself. The man she saved becomes the man she loses, not to death, but to a calling that apparently leaves no room for wives. Yet even in her silence, Zipporah's story speaks to contemporary issues that churches and believers still wrestle with today. What happens when spiritual calling conflicts with family obligations? How do we balance devotion to God with love for those closest to us? And what about the family members who get left behind when someone receives a dramatic call to ministry? These questions don't have easy answers, and perhaps that's why Zipporah's story remains so compelling despite its gaps and silences. She represents all the unnamed, unrecognized people who make sacrifices so that others can fulfill their divine destinies. She's the pastor's wife who gives up her career to support her husband's ministry. The missionary's child who grows up feeling like a stranger in multiple cultures. The prophet's family who learns to share their loved one with an entire community. But Zipporah's story also challenges us to think more deeply about the cost of our assumptions about spiritual leadership. If Moses really did need to separate from his wife in order to maintain his relationship with God, what does that say about the Hebrew understanding of holiness? And if that separation wasn't actually necessary but was based on cultural prejudices or personal choices, what does that tell us about the human tendency to spiritualize our failures in relationships? The mystery of what happened to Moses' mysterious wife becomes, in the end, a mirror that reflects our own struggles with faith, family, and the sometimes competing demands of divine calling and human love. Her silence speaks louder than words, challenging us to listen for the voices that have been forgotten and to consider the stories that haven't been told. As we continue to explore this ancient mystery, we'll discover that the questions raised by Zipporah's disappearance lead us into even deeper waters. Because if the Bible's silence about Moses' wife is puzzling, the extra-biblical traditions about his other relationships are absolutely shocking. And the implications of these hidden stories might just transform how we understand not only Moses but the very nature of God's relationship with all the nations of the earth. The plot is about to thicken considerably, and what we uncover next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the man who brought the law down from Mount Sinai.